My expectation is that prices, as meat supply increases, that prices will normalize and be reduced. And
That's the voice of Shimon Koffler-Fogel. He's CEO of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, speaking to us at the CJN Daily just hours after the Federal Court of Canada granted a reprieve to kosher meat production in this country. On Wednesday, a judge ordered the government agency, which regulates how cows are killed for food, to suspend enforcement of its new guidelines on shechita, or Jewish ritual slaughter of meat. His ruling comes a little more than 2 weeks after hearings were held in a Montreal courtroom as the Jewish community took the government to court. Now, while people can argue about whether shechita is more or less humane than what the government wants, the judge wasn't going to weigh in definitively on the science right now. He wrote those concerns aren't as important as what he called a real possibility of irreparable harm being done to the kosher meat industry in Canada and to the religious freedom of Jewish Canadians to practice their faith. So he put all the new government guidelines on hold until the issue can be settled once and for all down the road in a new court case. Jewish leaders have hailed this injunction as a victory, and as you heard, Koffler-Fogel expects it'll mean good news for Canada's domestic kosher meat business again, which he'd said had been threatened with disappearing. But in the meantime, while the industry and Jewish leaders and the government figure out what happens next, the judge's nearly 50-page ruling deserves our attention today because it raises some important issues about the workings of Canada's kosher meat industry, about who benefits, about whether Jews have to eat meat, and why living a Jewish life costs so much.
I think that to go and say that, well, we have to lower the prices so that we can go and enjoy, massive, charcuterie boards filled with meat so that we can stuff ourselves on Shabbat. I'm sorry, I'm not buying that argument. And it's not the responsibility of the government to go and ensure the prices are low so that you can have a lot of meat. So have a little.
I can't date women right now because I'm too busy calling myself a piece of shit.
I had a dysfunctional Jewish mother and I had a dysfunctional Native mother.
I had 25 full years of utter struggle and failure.
I started to realize the absurdity of my inability to let go of this monster of guilt.
Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Hi, I'm Ralph Benrig. I'm the host of Not That Kind of Rabbi, where we look at people's spiritual journeys and take a little time for their self-reflection, and maybe yours. You can get it all at thecjn.ca/NTKR or wherever you get your podcasts.
Less meat.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Monday, July 29th, 2024. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News. The dispute with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's updated kosher meat guidelines from 2019 flared up only a year ago in the summer of 2023 when the government started enforcing the rules. They never outlawed shechita. It just gave the Jewish community a choice. Be like everyone else and use an electric bolt to stun the animal before you slit the throat so that it doesn't feel undue pain, which the rabbis say they can't do because it makes the meat not kosher, or bolt stun the animal after shechita, which the rabbis agreed to do temporarily. Or, if you don't want to stun the animals at all, then you must wait for several minutes before the carcass can be hoisted on a pulley and the meat harvested. And in the meantime, you have to check the unconscious animal for 3 specific biological reflexes. Now, kosher meat producers argued all that extra waiting time and checking was making them lose money. One Quebec slaughterhouse stopped processing veal altogether. The others in Montreal were doing half the animals they used to. And for a while now, suppliers have been importing lots of meat from Mexico and Argentina to fill the kosher store shelves. But some consumers told the judge they don't trust that imported meat. It doesn't taste quite the same as homegrown animals, and that they can't practice their religion, which requires them to eat meat. For his take on that and on some of the party's other arguments, I'm joined by Avi Feingold, host of the CJN's Bonjour Chai podcast. He's a Canadian rabbi from Montreal who's been covering the kosher meat industry in Canada for years. He's now based in Chicago. Good to see you, Avi.
Great to be here, always.
First of all, the Jewish community is calling it a victory for Kashruth, for the Jewish life in Canada. What do you make of the significance of this legal victory?
It's a temporary injunction. It's not the government admitting we made a mistake. It's the government is saying, look, there's enough here for you to go and go about as you were while we review everything and figure out what the merits are exactly. To be fair, and I think that there are people who heard my episodes with the MK, with the COR, and think that I hate them and I think it's all wrong and kosher meat should be, slaughter should be illegal and all of this. And I'm like, it's not true. I'm very sympathetic to the fact that the MK and the COR and the meat producers are in a tough place sometimes, and things are difficult, and there's regulations all over. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't, completely submit to everything, and they shouldn't be, forced out of business. But, at the end of the day, it's good to have readily available sources of meat, of other products for consumers to enjoy. And when those things are gone, that's not a good thing.
When they talk in the ruling, you made the point about that it should be readily available for consumers. Let's say Jewish consumers. One of the points that the lawyers for the kosher community said was that this is key to having a sustainable Jewish community. In other words, if there's no readily available supply of Canadian kosher beef, people won't come and live, or they'll leave, or they won't make Canada a Jewish destination for the religious community. How does that work, knowing the community the way you do in Montreal and Toronto?
I mean, people like to have meat. People like to have meat on Shabbat. I know that they were arguing that it's an essential feature of the Jewish community, that it is, they turned it into a ritual idea that you have to have meat on Shabbat and on holidays and on enjoyment. And they relying on a lot of different sources that talk about the essential nature of meat. There's a line in the rabbinic literature, "Ein simcha ela bebasar v'yayin," right? There's no joy unless you have meat and wine. And I can go and argue just as much the opposite. If you're an alcoholic, you're not going to go and say, well, you don't have Shabbos because you can't have wine, and therefore your Shabbos is ruined, and you're not allowed to. You must have wine, even though it might be very, very unhealthy for you. If you're vegetarian, if you're vegan, right, you don't have to have meat. In fact, the Mishnah Berurah goes and says, who's another one of a famous halachic decider in the early 20th century, late 19th century. And he says, if you don't have access to meat, that's okay. You can have a beautiful Shabbat meal in other ways as well. So to go and argue that it's essential, it's a nice thing to have a good piece of meat, and that people talk about the fact that this elevates your meal. And remember, these was times when meat was not always readily available. When you had a small amount of meat, it was a wonderful thing to have. And so you save it for Shabbos. But that doesn't mean that you essentially have to have this meat access, all the time. If you have less meat, that's okay too. And if you don't have access to meat, that doesn't mean that your Shabbat is ruined, or your holidays or your simchas are ruined.
The judge even accepted the argument that this is a way that the Jewish community practices its faith.
So to go and say that it's a requirement, to go and say it's halachically mandated that one must have meat, that's preposterous, right? If you are a carnivore, if you do eat meat and you want to save some for Shabbos, yes, it's a nice thing to do. But to go and say, and again, I'm not arguing that everybody should be vegan. I eat meat on Shabbat. I eat meat during the week also sometimes. And to go and say that this is absolutely a must, it is mandated, you have to have this access to this meat, I don't buy that. I'm sorry. But communally, yes, socially, people do like to have meat on Shabbat, but I don't think that that's a legal argument. But again, I'm not a lawyer.
I'm going to read paragraph 78 of the judge's ruling. They said the government says that the applicants have not established that this veal must be produced in Canada religiously. In other words, if it's from Mexico or Argentina, then somehow you're violating the rules. This is what the judge wrote in his thinking. So he kind of bought that argument that they have to have it, but he wasn't so sure where it had to come from.
I don't like that the government's being put in a position to make decisions based on halacha, right? There are definitely people that would disagree with this position, and with the government saying that you can get your meat from anywhere. They're 100% right. They're importing meat from a variety of sources, and they can import meat from a variety of sources. If you've heard my episodes with the MK, you know that they're arguing that Montreal has this requirement that meat has to be slaughtered by Montreal shochetim, but they're sending shochetim everywhere around the world. They're sending them to Mexico. They're sending them elsewhere, and they're shechting that meat. They're slaughtering that meat in a way that is acceptable to them wherever they might be. So to go and say that you have to do this in Montreal, go do it somewhere else.
Having said that, the judge really took a lot of time in his decision on the impact on jobs for the Jewish shochetim, the ritual slaughters, and the bodkim, who are the checkers, I guess, and then the people who take the meat apart and what have you. And there's specifically one rabbi, Abraham Bannon, who was the expert shochet that was part of the community's case, that he's saying he lost half his work income since these new guidelines were implemented in 2023 because production is way down. And the judge accepted the argument that in restricting his work, you're restricting his freedom of religion under the Charter of Rights. I tried to get the numbers on how many people actually work in this industry in Canada. And CIJA told me there are 70 shochetim, mostly for chicken.
Mhm.
And there are Rabbi Emmanuel of MK Montreal said that for specific meat, it's 10 people that this impacts directly on their livelihood when there's a slowdown in production, because they talked about beef down about 55% in terms of production and veal down 90% since these new rules came in. So what do you make of the fact about the economic argument that this impacts Jewish people's economic livelihood versus they're practicing their faith?
If the government goes and mandates, just as an example, right, that everybody has to recycle, can somebody go bring a suit to the government and say, listen, I'm a trash collector, and all of a sudden my job is being eliminated because everybody's recycling and nobody's throwing out trash? Right? It's not the government's job to go and say to you, listen, I have to provide you a job because we've mandated something new. You can go and get retrained. You can go do something else. Nobody's forcing you. It's not like because you're a shochet, right? You can't be a good Jew because there's no more animals to shech. It's not your religious belief that you have to slaughter an animal. It's your religious belief that you have to believe in God and you have to do the commandments, right? That's your job that you got trained as. I'm sorry that you trained in a field where the market is down right now.
And people are eating less meat, not just kosher meat, but in general, people are eating a lot less meat for health reasons and climate change too. This Rabbi Bannon felt that his religious service to the community, this was a calling that he trained for, and that every time he does his job, he's being a religious leader. And even though the charter doesn't guarantee his livelihood to do a particular job, it's the fact that he can't carry out his religious beliefs, which do violate the charter. So that's the argument that the rabbis were saying, and that the judge had to rule on. This is what the applicants were saying.
Right. That's not the government's responsibility to go and say, well, you have a training that you can go serve God in many, many ways.
What do you feel about this argument that the prices for consumers make it inaccessible to Jewish people who want to practice their faith?
Meat prices are going up everywhere. It's a market economy. And if you want to know what meat is expensive, go to Vancouver. Have you spoken to anybody from Vancouver? The meat prices, because there is nobody slaughtering on the left side of Canada, and they're importing it all from Montreal and Toronto themselves. The meat prices are double or triple what it is in Montreal and Toronto. And people are buying meat. They're just buying a little less of it. And, they're making do, and they're saying there's other things I can put on my plate. I currently live in Chicago right now. Chicago happens to have, on a regular basis, in the kosher grocery store, meat that is labeled Montreal Kosher Shrita meat. And it is cheaper than buying it in Montreal. And this is after they have to import it into a different country and transport it all the way here. So what does that say to you about what Montreal is doing?
Well, it's actually in the ruling that the Jewish community, when they were arguing, the judge said, look, you admitted Canadian kosher beef slaughter, 30 to 40% of it is exported to the United States. There were some arguments made in the court case that there isn't such a big market for the whole cow or half the cow in Canada. They can't sell all the cuts that they need in Canada, but in the States, for example, they could sell more kosher hot dogs. So that's why a lot of it goes to the States, because otherwise it would go to waste. What did you see when you went to the grocery store near your house? What kind of cuts were they?
They had rib steaks. Rib steaks are readily available in Montreal also. It's not like they went and said, well, we don't want rib steaks. We want to send them to Chicago. So these are clearly meat that they were sending out that is quality meat also, that is the prime cuts of the animal. And they were selling it for $23.99 a pound. I do believe that was cheaper than what it costs in Montreal. And that's just one example that I saw, but I'm usually seeing the same cuts of meat that I would have seen in Montreal. You can also educate the consumer and say, here, there are different cuts of meat that you can enjoy just because you want certain pieces. And that means we get to export it all. I'm sorry, but clearly there's some commerce involved here that strikes me as a little bit disingenuous. They're trying to argue both sides from, to the government one side and to their people something else. But I think you're right. I think that their meat prices are through the roof sometimes because they're able to.
So I'm just looking at the Mahadran website. These are one of the main Mahadran meats in Montreal, one of the main distributors, and they do also the slaughter for pretty much everyone in Canada. Veal scallopini, $96.49 a kilogram.
Yeah.
Osso buco veal, $66.99 a kilogram. If you look, lean minced meat, family pack, $40.99 a kilogram. Shochetim meat, $32.35 a kilo. This is a temporary relief because the judge said there's enough evidence for me that this could be dangerous for the Charter of Rights of our freedom of religion in Canada. It wasn't a ruling on the science. He did not say that. However, the Jewish community said this is a vindication that shechita is humane.
All of the discussion on the merits, that there might be merit, and we want to have a full review of it, was on all of the extra shechita-related issues at hand, namely the Sabbath issue, the job issue, and the importation, the exporting. All of these things were factors. No discussion was made. There was no discussion related to the humaneness of shechita was in question at all. The thing that one has to remember is that Judaism does not mandate you to slaughter animals. It's if you want to have meat, right, then you have to go and slaughter it in this manner. But if you never slaughter an animal, or if you never eat an animal, that doesn't make you a bad Jew. And I think that that's a very important point that they are trying to argue that this is an essential feature of Judaism. And it's only a feature if you choose to go in that direction. And if there's no animals around, you can't slaughter because there's no animals around, that doesn't mean that you're all of a sudden, violating the commandments.
That in the Torah, for the priests, for the three major holidays, the three regalim, where you have to go up to sacrifice animals, that is in the Torah, and that you're required to eat this kind of
time of the temple.
Meat.
There's no temple.
The time of the temple, right? So how does that work?
It's, again, if you eat meat in the time of the temple, yes, there were daily sacrifices that were being offered. And there's actually disagreements in contemporary rabbinics as to what that's going to look like. If the temple showed up tomorrow, there are rabbis that will say, no, there's not going to be even slaughter anymore. We're just going to have, grain-based sacrifices. That was a very famous position of several rabbis in the 20th century. But we can leave that aside. Everybody's aware that there is no temple anymore, so there is no more mandated slaughter.
There was an economic problem, which is that production line, and the beef is going like 3 minutes, 2.5 minutes in between cows instead of like 20, 30 seconds. However long it takes to do shechita, it's longer with these 3 telltale biological signs that you need to see. So they were like, we can't afford to have kosher meat. And that was the economic reason for it. So that's why the rabbis temporarily allowed bolt stunning after the shechita, so that the animal would be considered, quote unquote, unconscious faster and could move the animal out quicker. That's the reason they temporarily allowed. What the government wants all meat producers to do is bolt stun, except they want it done before, and Kashruth, from what I understand, doesn't allow it.
I can say that if they're allowing it now, then clearly it's not Kashruth doesn't allow it. They have found a halachic loophole that allows it in some way, and if they find a halachic loophole that allows it in some way, they should be able to find a loophole to extend it beyond that. They're not going to serve meat that they don't consider to be acceptable halachically just because they're in this position right now. They'll go and say either we send all the meat to be imported into Canada, or they'll go and say that that's what it takes, is we have to do this. Or if they choose to wait the time, then it's not the government's problem to go and do that. At the end of the day, let's be honest, selling meat is a commerce, right? It's a business. And if there are expenses added to a business because of some reason that the government chooses to find valid, despite whatever religious restrictions that they say we're not hindering your freedom of religion, we're just taking extra time to make sure that it fits our things also. And if that means that it costs more money, then it's not their problem to go and say, well, this is an impinging on religion. It just means that it costs more to practice your religion. It costs more to practice our religion already anyways. Day school costs a fortune. Keeping Shabbat costs, money. There's real costs involved in keeping Shabbat. You can't go to government and say, listen, I need a hot water urn for Shabbat. I have to go and spend extra money. This is impinging my religion, and I need money from the government to be compensated for that. Or school costs are going to cost more. In Ontario, people would love it if the government would finally say, listen, Catholic schools schools get money, Jewish schools should get money too. That's just as much a religious freedom issue as the slaughtering of meat and costing you a few extra dollars per kilo on your meat purchases.
Well, there's a whole bunch of lawsuits that would argue the difference, and that they do need to help, especially in Quebec and education and Ontario parents as well. I paid $8 for a challah last Friday, so that's a lot of money. People can't afford that. I want to thank Avi Feingold for being on this side of the microphone with us. Everybody's going to Avi's house for Shabbat, and they're going to stock up on kosher meat in your city and then sneak it back across the border. You're not allowed to bring it back across the border.
You're allowed 10 kilos at a time, from what I understand.
Many 10 kilos at a time? All right.
I believe so, yeah.
Not everybody agrees with Avi's take on whether Jews must eat meat. CJA's Shimon Koffler-Fogel has a different interpretation.
Meat and wine are associated with festivals, celebrations, and the like. I was surprised, frankly, that they didn't use as a proof point something that is immediately obvious. In the ramp up to Tisha B'Av, the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, the 9 days from the beginning of the month until actually the 10th of Av, we are forbidden from eating meat because we're supposed to be in a very somber, semi-mournful kind of mood. And the reason we don't eat meat is because meat is associated with celebration. And you know, if you think about it, it was not part of the mainstay fare of a typical family during the week. So it really was reserved for special occasions. From a religious point of view, there's no more special an occasion than Shabbat or the holidays. And so meat became associated with appropriate celebration on those festive or holy days. You know, it is really a fundamental feature of holidays and Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh and celebrations like marriages and so forth. And it's not because of meat, it's because of what meat represents in terms of the significance of the day.
Okay, is there somewhere in the Torah where it says that?
So there are many references to it. Basar v'dagim, meat and fish. Certainly the codes of Jewish law and the Talmud are replete with references to it in association with ritual observance and the like. So you know, it's not custom. It's and even if you think about it, back in temple times, the significant sacrifices that were undertaken in association with the pilgrimage festivals, Rosh Chodesh, Shabbat, and the like, were all meat sacrifices that weren't burnt up, they were consumed. So, of course, the quintessential is the Paschal Lamb, and people were obligated to eat it on Passover.
The Canadian Food Inspection Agency says it's reviewing the judge's legal ruling, so we don't know if they will appeal. Koffler-Fogel says he hopes they won't need a second court case to settle the dispute, but can work things out instead. And meetings have actually already started, he says, with officials and the Agriculture Minister, Lawrence Macaulay. The veal company Montpac couldn't say if or when it will resume kosher veal production. A well-known kosher chicken producer in Ontario, Premier Family Farms, has just been given the green light by CORE 5 days ago to start producing kosher beef and lamb very soon. And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily. Our show is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman. Our executive producer is Michael Freeman, and our music is by Dov Beck-Levine. I'd welcome your feedback on this issue, and if you want to read the judgment for yourselves, we've put the link in our show notes. Thanks for listening.
Y'all remember that joke from Airplane? The old lady asked for some light reading.
How about this leaflet, famous Jewish sports legends?
But in actuality, that's changing. Jews are crushing it in sports around the world, and we are here to celebrate them.
Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout.
Zach Hyman, his first career hat trick. 41 points for Diddy Avdia. It's Sue Bird's building.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jamie.
We love Jews and we love sports, but most of all, we love kvelling over Jews in sports.
Together we host Menschwarmers, the longest running Jewish sports podcast in the world. Listen and subscribe at thecjn.ca and wherever you find your podcasts.